Okay, today's scripture passage is Mark 3, verses 1 through 6. You're invited to turn there or follow along on the screen behind me. This is entitled, Jesus Heals on the Sabbath, starting with verse 1 of chapter 3. Another time Jesus went to the synagogue, and a man with a shriveled hand was there. Some of them were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus, so they watched him closely to see if he would heal him on the Sabbath. Jesus said to the man with the shriveled hand, "Stand up in front of everyone." Then Jesus asked them, "Which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil, to save life or to kill?" But they remained silent. He looked around them in anger and deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts, said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and his hand was completely restored. Then the Pharisees went out and began to plot with the Herodians how they might kill Jesus. This is God's word.
We have seen that Jesus had critics, and Jesus' critics were having a very hard time knowing what to do with his behavior, which was not in line with a lot of what they thought his behavior should be. They were having a hard time dealing with some of the claims that he was making, which to them were absolutely blasphemous. They were having a hard time knowing what to do with some of the things he was teaching. Now, most recently, last Sunday, we saw this tension between Jesus and his critics manifested over his behavior on what they called the Shabbat, the Sabbath. I like to say it the way they do. They didn't understand why he behaved the way he behaved on the Shabbat. Now, you will remember that these critics of Jesus, these folks who were extremely Jewish, they valued highly their historically rooted, their time-honored paradigms regarding the way people were supposed to behave on the Shabbat. And we talked about the fact that there were so many layers of restriction upon restriction upon restriction that had been added over the span of about 1,500 years, that Sabbath regulations had become an immense burden for Jewish people. And yet, these were enforced very strongly. I would say even this, that their Jewishness, these critics of Jesus, their Jewishness was in large part defined by these distinctions about the way they behaved on the Shabbat. It was a huge issue. And then here comes Jesus strolling along, and he calls into question 1,500 years of theological and cultural thinking about Sabbath behavior, and treats it as though he has the authority to revise all of it. Now, tell me, how do you feel when something questions the authority of the Constitution of the United States? Isn't it almost like anathema for you to think of somebody doing something that is unconstitutional? It starts messing with the Constitution. Now, need I say that that's not inspired? Okay? And need I say that that's how many hundred years old? It's not 1,500 years old. And yet, we become exasperated at the thought. We're offended at something being unconstitutional. How do you think, after 1,500 years of theological and cultural thinking has been established, how do you think these folks would feel about Jesus coming along and basically treating it as though it bends to him? That should give you a little bit of perspective. Jesus actually calls out these cultural and religious guardians of Jewish faith when he says, and here we look at Matthew chapter 12, verses 7 and 8. We did look at this on the side last week. He calls them out and he says, "If you guys had known what these words mean," and then he quotes the prophet Hosea chapter 6 and verse 6. "If you guys had known what these words mean," quote, "I desire mercy," says God, "not sacrifice. If you'd known what that means, you would not have condemned the innocent. For the Son of Man is Lord of the Shabbat." Of course, Jesus said that in response to a rebuke that he was receiving at the hands of his critics for the way he was allowing his disciples to behave on a Sabbath. Remember how they were walking through the grain fields and they were plucking the heads and they were cracking them open between their fingers and eating them? And the Pharisees were watching this, and these cultural guardians, these religious guardians, were offended in that they were technically breaking Sabbath rules and that they were working, they were threshing, they were preparing meals on the Shabbat. And so Jesus says this to them. And then he makes this claim. And frankly, I don't think you and I have any capacity for understanding how insulting, infuriating, and how outrageous this claim must have been to these critics when he said, the Son of Man is Lord, even of the Shabbat. You have no idea how that must have upset them, because it was an enormous claim. It was an outrageous claim, frankly, that astonished and infuriated them. And in today's event, we actually begin to see the extent to which that is true. Because the next event that Mark records for us is almost like the straw that breaks the camel's back. I tried to find a word for what happens when something that has been beginning to grow in you becomes firmly ensconced in you to the fullest extent. What word? Crystallized? It becomes hardened into you? There's a word that escapes me. But this antagonism toward Jesus happens in their hearts, most likely as the result of the event that you are about to discuss. And it involves the Shabbat, just like last week's did. So let's look at it. Mark 3, 1 and 2, it begins with these words. Another time Jesus went to the synagogue, and a man with a shriveled hand was there. Some of them, you can question who the them is. We'll talk about it a little more later. Some of them were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus. And where were they? In the service at church. They were in the synagogue. And they were there because they wanted to accuse Jesus. And so they watched him closely to see if he would heal on the Shabbat. Okay, now we talked about this about a month ago. We made allusion to this. I just want to make a real brief allusion to it again. We have seen that it was Jesus' practice to attend the public gatherings for worship among the people of God on the Shabbat. He would go to synagogue. It was always his practice. And I pointed out to you that it didn't matter that Jesus knew how screwed up it all was. It did not matter that he knew the hypocrisy of the people, the hypocrisy and the messed upness of the people who were responsible. He knew that way better than you do, and yet some of you, and I'm preaching to the choir here, some of you get your nose all out of a joint, and sometimes you start to feel like, you know what, I'm just going to boycott. I'm just pulling out of this whole church thing. I mean, a bunch of hypocrites. It's so messed up. It did not stop Jesus. Don't you think that you are a higher judge than Jesus when it comes to being offended by what you find in your fellow worshipers? It didn't keep him from gathering. So anyway, I just reinforce that again. It keeps striking me that Jesus keeps going to synagogue. Now, right off the bat, in the first verse, we find that there is a spirit in the midst of the assembly that day that is foreign. A spirit that should not be there. I'm going to call it a demonic spirit, although this demonic spirit looks quite different than a demonic spirit that Jesus encountered in the synagogue in Capernaum at an earlier date, and we talked about that. This particular demonic spirit was wearing religious, self-righteous, holy garb, sanctified garb. And it came in the form of Pharisees who had attended service that Shabbat with an ungodly motivation. Look at Mark 3, verse 2. Some of them were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus. Made me think, okay, you know, there are a lot of motivations that people have for coming to church. And I know I'm kind of blurring the lines between synagogue and church here. Really, it's irrelevant for my purposes here. There are many motivations for which people gather together for public worship. Some of them are great, some of them are not so good. what motivations brought you here this morning. I can tell you that the most religiously respected people in Judaism of that day gathered together for worship with a foul spirit. They had come to entrap Jesus. This is a demonic spirit. They were using another human being as bait in their trap. Now, let me ask a question. Why would anybody want to accuse Jesus? A man who's going around with a message of good news for people. The good news of the kingdom of God. There is a Father who loves you and is reaching to you, who's inviting you to sup with him in life and forever. A man who's going around doing nothing but healing people, putting their lives back together for them. Why does anybody want to accuse him? And what does it tell us about these folks? About what was going on deeply in their hearts, these paragons of Judaism. Allow me to suggest a thought or two about this. The sheer power of Jesus' person, guys, when we run into it, when we come face to face with the sheer power of Jesus, it makes certain demands upon us. You can't avoid it. It can't be helped. An encounter face to face with Jesus is going to threaten some deeply held idols in your soul, in your heart. Idols that you probably don't even know that you have. Perhaps like the idol of your very familiar and comfortable paradigms. Paradigms for like, what's this all about anyway? Why do I live? For what do I live? Why am I here? What brings fulfillment? What is the good life? You have answers for all of these questions. You probably are not aware that you have answers for those questions, but you live your life in pursuit of answering those questions, of living out what it is that you believe on those things. What does it mean to be a good person? How do I invest my life wisely? All of these paradigms, you live in pursuit of those things, often without even realizing what you're doing. And then you come face to face with Jesus, and you realize that Jesus is going to challenge those paradigms. He will want to turn them upside down. And frankly, many people say, I'm not willing to reconsider this. I am not about to change these paradigms. I'm not going to challenge them. And so you have war. You have a clash. How about the idol of self-worship? Jesus comes along and he's going to expose an idol in your heart, this idol of self-worship, because Jesus comes along and the power of his person insists that he be Lord. But you don't like the thought of not being your own master. And so there's conflict. How about the idol of self-satisfaction? You live your life the way you want to live it. You don't like the thought of not depending upon yourself. You think you can do it well. You want to be a self-made person. You want to be able to handle all of this. And Jesus comes along and he says, no, you can't depend upon yourself. You will depend upon me. And another idol is challenged. And you see all of this in these people who have come to church this day to entrap Jesus, to accuse him, to find wrongdoing in him. Largely, he was challenging the idol of their pride. You and I don't like people cutting in on our turf or our position of influence, and yet this was clearly happening. And so, as these things were what drove these folks, they were not going to go down without a bloodbath. And so they went to synagogue that day to accuse Jesus and find reason to take him down. Now, Mark tells us that there was in synagogue that day a man with a shriveled hand or a withered hand, depending on what translation you read. Now, this is a rather curious circumstance, and give me a few minutes to unpack this. First of all, the hand was shriveled or withered. Exeramenein is the word which means having been withered. And it helps picture-wise in your mind to realize that's the same word that describes the fig tree that Jesus walked by one day and cursed, and then the next day they walked by and it had shriveled. It's like it had been dead for 10 years. What does that tree look like when this has been done to it? Well, that's the same word that describes the man's limb, okay? And I thought, now, isn't there some sort of prohibition here? And I thought, yeah, let's follow this up on. I actually found a more scholarly article by a student named Stephen Hernandez who's exegeted this particular passage. And I want you to see a part of what he wrote, because this sort of helps me go where I want to go here. Stephen Hernandez, in his paper on this passage, wrote this: because the man with the withered hand, and I put this in italics, should not be allowed in the synagogue, the italics are mine, okay? And here he is making an allusion to some Old Testament law found in Leviticus chapter 21, verses 16 through 24. Because, he says, the man with the withered hand should not be allowed in the synagogue, it is suspicious that the Pharisees already knew what Jesus might do and heal him. It is very possible that they allowed the man against code, or even called the man against code, into the synagogue to test Jesus. Now let me put it this way. I believe that man was there as a plant. He was there as so much bait in a trap. Have you ever worked with somebody who really did not like you? Have you ever worked with a person who did not like you to the point that they were watching you closely to find some reason to bring you before your supervisor? Now, how about we take it even a step to the worse? Have you ever worked with somebody who disliked you so much that they were actually setting traps for you, hoping that you would fall into them so that they would have reason to get you in trouble with your superiors? That's what you've got going on here in the synagogue that day among the most spiritually revered people in Israel. I think this is what we would call a type of sting operation. Wikipedia helped me out this week here with that. Wikipedia says, if you can trust that, in law enforcement, a sting operation is a deceptive operation designed to catch a person committing a crime. A typical sting will have an undercover law enforcement agent or detective or a cooperative member of the public play a role as a criminal partner or potential victim and go along with a suspect's actions in order to gather evidence of the suspect's wrongdoing. So we got a sting operation going on in the middle of church on this Sabbath, and it's being directed by the most spiritually minded people, so-called, in all of Israel. It's shocking. Now, the hardened posture of these folks towards Jesus blows my mind. But it doesn't stop there. It's not only hardened toward Christ, their hearts are hardened in another way. And it shows itself in their treatment of a fellow human being. These supposedly spiritual leaders don't seem to care a lick about the well-being of a man with a withered hand. They only want to use him to entrap Jesus. And the more you watch the scene play out, the more you become convinced that this is true. Now, this man is in a very tough situation. Now, there is an apocryphal writing. It's not considered scripture in our circles, but it is of the same era. And this apocryphal writing actually has a description of some detail pertaining to this event. And I share with you part of what it says. This apocryphal writing says that this man was a stonemason whose right hand had been wrecked by disease, I thought, or even by injury, leaving him unemployable, unable to earn a living, and barring him from the worship life of the community. Now, these are things you don't normally think about when you think about this incident. And the Pharisees recognize in this man an opportunity to take Jesus down because of what has happened to this man. And so they bring him into the service that day. Now, regardless of whether or not this apocryphal account is considered accurate by you, and it really doesn't matter. I think everybody can pretty much agree that this man was in a pitiable condition. Because I think it is true that he can't work, and it's hard for him to make a living, and he's supposed to be barred from public worship. But here, Judaism's leaders show no compassion for the man. They have no interest whatsoever in his well-being. They only want to use him. And they use him to help them in their plot to take down Jesus. Now that, friends, is a sad state of affairs. They objectify him. They turn him into an object to be used for their own ends and purposes. Do you know what angers God? Stuff like this. Stuff like this. Look at verse 5, the first part of it. He, Jesus, looked around at them in anger and deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts, ... More in a few minutes. Now, here's another angle of this that I want you to consider that helps to show the extremity of the hardness of heart of these spiritual people. Jesus' critics, these most spiritual people in all of Judaism at the time, seem to have expected Jesus to heal this man. Get it? That's why they brought the man with the withered hand into the synagogue. They expected that Jesus will heal him. Apparently, it's no longer a question in their minds whether or not he can do it. And all they want to do is take him down. Not only that, not only do they expect him to be able to heal him, they know enough of his character and his compassion to know that he will do it. He can, and he will. They know this about Jesus, and yet they want to kill him for it. I thought, how odd is this? Israel's spiritual shepherds not only believed Jesus could heal this man, but they also knew his compassion well enough to know that he would heal this man, and they want to kill him for it. Isn't that odd? How messed up do you have to be that you would stand there face to face with the power to heal and the compassion to heal, all combined in one person, and focus instead on the technicality that it's the Sabbath day? Talk about not being able to see the forest for the trees. And I thought, you know what, this can't be a 2,000-year-old issue only. This has got to be in me somewhere. This has got to be in you somewhere. And I thought, how does this show itself in us? Well, it does. And I kind of had to burn some brain cells in order to come up with something. But I thought, okay, so let's imagine a very notorious, very hardened, violent criminal coming to Christ in such a way that it becomes well known that this person has become a Christ follower. And it has become very obvious that this is not the same person. Things have really changed in this person. And then you and I make the statement, you know what? This cannot be of God. That person was baptized by sprinkling. This is not of God. We do that stuff. You know that, right? This person was not baptized in the right way, or so we think. Have we not done what the Pharisees do? We're focusing on a technicality, and we're completely missing the power of God. Now, this particular technicality, which was the technicality that was creating all of these problems repeatedly, was over Sabbath rules. It was a recurring theme between Jesus and the Pharisees. Did you know that the Gospels are filled with multiple healings like this on the Sabbath? And each time it happened, this conversation occurred again and again and again. See, to the Pharisees, Jesus healing on the Shabbat was a violation of Shabbat law. Now, let's look at Jesus' response on this occasion. It's verses 3 and 4, Mark chapter 3. Jesus said to the man with the shriveled hand, and here's another one where I ask myself, what inflection am I to give these words of Jesus? What would you say? Jesus said to the man with the shriveled hand, stand up in front of everyone. No, I don't think that's the right inflection, because he's talking to the man. Jesus said to the man with the shriveled hand, stand up in front of everyone. Is he not in some way contributing to the objectification of this man? I think not. I think not. He invites the man to stand up in front. Now, I want you to realize that it wouldn't have been set up, the room, like this, with everybody facing one direction. This would have been a situation where it's more like theater in the round. You've got stone benches around the outside, and whoever was going to stand did so up in the middle. Okay, so he's got people looking at him on all sides. And he tells this man to stand up in front of everyone. And then Jesus asked them. Notice he doesn't ask the man, he asked them. Who's the them? Yes, those that are there to accuse him. He asked them as the man stands up, which is lawful on the Shabbat? To do good or to do evil? And what answers does he expect you to give? It would be lawful to do good on the Shabbat and not to do evil. Which is lawful on the Shabbat? To save life or to kill? What does he expect you to think? Don't worry about it, Rich. It's all good. He kicked over his coffee. He's probably fallen asleep. No. So he expects you to say it is right to save life, to do good on the Shabbat. Now notice the brilliance of the question. There's no way that they can answer to that without hanging themselves in their own noose. This is what Jesus is master at. And he's not just toying with people, he's trying to cut to the heart always. Now, Mark's telling of these events is always very abbreviated. We've pointed that out. He was a man of very few words. He always cuts back to the bare bones. Matthew, of course, gives us a little bit more detail about what went on and what was said here. And Matthew actually paints a picture that shows us that it was actually the Pharisees who initiated this conversation. Let's look what Matthew has to say. Describing the same event, Matthew 12 says, looking for a reason to bring charges against Jesus, they asked him, notice who asked who? They asked him, is it lawful to heal on the Shabbat? Now you can see why Jesus probably says, let me ask you, is it good to do right on the Shabbat or to do evil? To save life or to kill? Okay, so that follows very logically then. And then he follows it with this in verse 13. He says to them, if any of you has a sheep and it falls into a pit on the Shabbat, will you not take hold of it and lift it out? And what answer does he expect you to give? Yes, of course. Now we start to get to the heart of Jesus. Notice the exclamation point at the end of the next phrase. How much more valuable is a person than a sheep? The key is starting to be unfolded for us. Notice what Jesus is valuing here. Notice what he's emphasizing. Now, on another similar occasion, which is another Sabbath healing by Jesus, it's a different event, but I want you to see the same conversation and how Jesus talks in that setting. This is found in Luke 14, verses 5 through 6. Then he asked them, the same people, accusing of the same problem. He says, if one of you has a child or an ox that falls into a well on a Shabbat day, will you not immediately pull it out? And they had nothing to say. See the same thing over and over and over again. Now notice something important here. For Jesus, this is about love. His actions are governed by love. Love for his Father. I only do what I see the Father doing. The works that I do are the works of the Father. And love for people. Now, in the hearts of the Pharisees, there is no love in either direction for God or for people. It's all about law for the Pharisees. To them, apparently, love takes a back seat to the law, and particularly on the Shabbat. It's interesting, and I found this phrase in that same guy whose scholarly article on the Mark passage I quoted to you earlier, Stephen Hernandez. He points out that love takes no days off for Jesus. There is no day off on the Shabbat. Love will guide him. And I thought, boy, that's really beautiful. I like that. And I thought, you know what? You and I give ourselves a pass when we don't want to do the loving thing all the time. Love takes time off for you and me. For Jesus, it does not take time off. He always has love as his guide. And he even said that when you and I love God and when we love each other, what happens to the law? It is fulfilled. We are doing it. Okay? I found a quote from William Barclay here that I liked, and he's talking about sacred things like the Sabbath laws. And Barclay said, the sacred things are only truly sacred when they are used for men or other people. For instance, the showbread was never so sacred as when it was used to feed a starving man. And of course, we saw that in the account of last week, the consecrated bread when it fed David. And Barclay says the Shabbat was never so sacred as when it was used to help those who needed help, like this man with a withered hand. And then he says this, the final arbiter in the use of all things is love, not law. And now we're about to see the denouement of this incident which hardened the tension, the hatred inside of Jesus' critics. Here's how it unravels. Mark 3:5. He looked around at them in anger and deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts, said to the man, stretch out your hand. And I wondered, did the man think to himself, I can't, it won't cooperate. And it just says that he stretched out his hand and it was completely restored. A regenerative miracle, instantaneously, right there in front of everyone, including Jesus' critics. Nobody could argue with it. Boom! Now, I asked myself a couple of other questions about this. Guys, would it not have been just simpler for Jesus, maybe even wiser for Jesus, just to schedule an appointment with the man? Say, look, come see me tomorrow morning when it's not Sabbath anymore. Come see me at 6 a.m. We'll take care of that hand for you. Wouldn't that have been simpler? We wouldn't have to go through all this garbage with his critics. Wouldn't it have been wiser? Did Jesus not know that the Pharisees wanted him to heal the man, so he'd be nailing himself to the wall? Yeah, I think Jesus knew that. So why does Jesus insist on doing this now? Why not just wait 12 hours? I think to do so, guys, would have been to avoid dealing with the damning lie that following rules makes people right with God. I think that would have been to endorse the lie that tells us that what God wants from us is mere rule keeping and careful observance of the right religious rituals. Now, Jesus could not allow that to go unchallenged. Now then, have you guys ever gone home from church having been really angered? Something that was said, something that somebody did, something that somebody should have done but didn't do. Went home from church angry. You probably have. Have you ever left church wanting to kill someone? It happened that day. It happened that day. Mark 3:6. Then the Pharisees went out and began to plot with the Herodians how they might kill Jesus. Now, that's a rough day in church. Now, is it not odd that there's no rejoicing that the man has his life back and he can gain a livelihood again? If he has kids, that he can provide for them again? That his hand is fully normal and functional again? Where's the rejoicing with those who rejoice? Crickets. Do they care about the man? No. It's like I said. If something like this were to happen in your midst here today, do you think there would not be some sort of celebrative worship of God for the miracle that you had just watched happen before your very eyes? Crickets. At least on those fronts. Those men stormed out of there, kicking over benches, slamming doors, furious at what Jesus had done. And I cannot help but draw a contrast in my mind between the anger that Jesus displayed about their hardness of heart and the anger that they displayed toward Jesus. See, the Pharisees are angry because Jesus was diminishing their influence. The Pharisees are angry because Jesus is undermining their authority. The Pharisees are angry because Jesus is winning the popular vote. Ever heard the phrase, politics makes strange bedfellows? Well, now this is very true, because Mark tells us that the Pharisees stormed out of synagogue that day, and they made a beeline to form an alliance with a group called the Herodians. Now listen to this. Did you know that the Pharisees actually despised the Herodians? Who were the Herodians? They were not a religious sect like the Pharisees and the Sadducees were. This was a secular group. The Herodians were Jewish folks who were sympathetic with King Herod, who was their so-called king, and yet wasn't even Jewish. King Herod cared nothing about the unique and weird religious ideas of the Jews. His mother was Nabatean and his father was Idumean. He's not even Jewish, and yet somehow, through a weird twist of things historical, he is thought to be a king over the Jews here. And yet he's a puppet king because he's in the pocket of Caesar. And he has only a certain limited amount of authority. But the Pharisees, these really ultra-religious types, they despised them because they were no better than tax collectors, because they were sympathizers with the authorities. They were not good Jews, these Herodians. And yet, the Pharisees find it to their advantage to go out of church that day and form an alliance with these people that they looked down as secular dogs, and form an alliance because they thought it would help them exterminate Jesus, which it probably did. How pragmatic, how unprincipled, how satanic. So it had been a crazy day at church. And hopefully you will leave here with a much different experience for having been here. Hopefully you won't leave here wanting to kill somebody. One final thought about this. Why has Mark even include this for us? Let's set it back in its larger context. Jesus is being shown to us by Mark. All of these incidents from the life of Jesus are described for us by Mark so that we will see in Jesus something absolutely astonishing and extraordinary. That this is not a normal, typical person, because normal, ordinary, mere people do not do things like this, nor do they say things like this, nor do they claim things like this. And Mark is convinced that this is worth your consideration. And Mark has a very strong desire that when you see these things, you will make Jesus your Lord, which is why he has penned this. And that's his desire. So set that all in context when you see this event on this day. Despite the critics and their voices, listen to Mark's heartbeat as he pens.